Welcome to Shadowed Tales Archive. Tonight, we invite you to descend into darkness with a chilling anthology of horror stories, each one inspired by true events. This is episode 4. Let the nightmare begin. Whispers on Alder Street. I always get a little uncomfortable when the topic of the paranormal comes up, particularly when some people seem to be so adamant that ghosts simply can't exist. I don't attempt to convince them otherwise. As a matter of fact, I don't share my experiences with them at all. This is actually the first time I've attempted to chronicle everything my family went through. It was only for a brief window in time, just a few months, but it burned a scar into my consciousness that will never go away. I remember my mother and father being so excited at the prospect of all of us moving into our first house. They had been raising 4 young children in an apartment. Just the idea of finally having our own bedrooms and more than one bathroom had us all elated. When we first glimpsed the house at the corner of 13th and Elm, my siblings and I almost couldn't believe it. The place seemed enormous. It was an old colonial style house with wide open rooms on the first floor and all of the bedrooms on the second floor, connected by a grand old wooden staircase. My brother and sisters and I raced through the place, exploring each room with a sense of excitement and wonder. It was my brother Noah who first noticed the door in the corner of the kitchen that led to the basement. He swung it open, and he and I stood at the top of the stairs, peering down for a few moments. We carefully descended down into the basement, unsure of what we would find. Once we got to the bottom of the stairs, we were a little disappointed with how benign it seemed to be. It was a bare room with a concrete floor, a utility sink in one corner, and a single window that would have been peering out into the garden in the front yard. We gazed around at this rather boring space for a minute before Noah noticed it. "Hey, what's with the floor over there?" He pointed to a patch in the concrete, about 4 feet long and 3 feet wide. It was a different color and texture than the rest of the concrete. It had obviously been torn up at some point and then patched up. I didn't think much of it until Noah spoke up. "You know the lady that lived here died, right?" I didn't know that. I recall my mom and dad mentioning something briefly about the family that owned the house having to move out in a hurry. The circumstances behind were never discussed, as far as I can remember. Noah continued, "Yeah, she died in a really bad car accident. Dad said so." "So," I countered, growing a little uneasy. "Well, I bet that's where they buried her, right there," Noah said, pointing to the odd patch in the concrete. For some reason, this ridiculous theory seemed to make sense in our child minds. I distinctly remember right at that moment, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air felt electric. I could feel all the hairs on my arms stand up. I was suddenly claustrophobic and felt a wave of panic and unease wash over me. I didn't even respond to Noah. I dashed up the stairs as fast as I could. Noah was right on my heels, chuckling at how easy it was to freak out his little brother. Once I was back in the kitchen with the thrum of activity going on, the feeling passed instantly, like flipping a light switch off. The next few days were a blur of unpacking and getting settled. Noah got his own room at the top of the stairs, and I got the one next to him. Our older sisters Rachel and Emily shared the bigger bedroom across the hall. My dad was a long-haul trucker who would be gone for days, sometimes a week at a time, so we had barely gotten moved into the house when he reluctantly had to go on a road for a few days. The first inkling that something wasn't quite right with the house happened the next morning after he had left. My siblings and I were walking out the front door to get on the bus to school, and we noticed a cigarette, but lying on the wooden front porch. Not exactly strange, but we knew it wasn't there before. We had cleaned the house top to bottom after moving in, including the porch. A rather obvious cigarette, but lying directly in front of the door would have been noticed. But there it was. We all kind of caught each other's glances as we looked at it. We shrugged and got on the school bus and went on with our day. A few days later, my brother Noah and I were playing outside in the yard when we noticed a second cigarette, but this time on the lawn, directly under Rachel and Emily's bedroom window. Once again, Noah was there with a brilliant theory to scare the pants off of me. "I bet it's the family that used to live here. They keep coming back and hanging around outside. because they know their mom is buried in the basement. The mention of the grave in the basement made my eyes wander over to the single window in the basement that was barely visible at ground level. It was at that moment that I was certain someone was looking back at me through that window. Noah read the expression on my face and followed my gaze to the window. "We should go check it out down there," he said. I reluctantly followed him. As uncomfortable as I was going down there, I was more sensitive to looking like a wuss in front of my older brother. As we got to the door to the basement, even Noah paused. "We should take Shadow with us," he said, referring to our family mutt. "Shadow will protect us." Shadow was an easygoing, agreeable fellow. I guess he would have to be, with four rambunctious children constantly terrorizing him. We found him dozing next to the couch in the living room. Noah grabbed him by the collar and led him over to the basement door. When Noah swung the door open, Shadow immediately resisted. He plopped his butt down on the kitchen floor and refused to move an inch. Noah yanked on his collar, but Shadow pulled back. Eventually, Noah decided to just pick the dog up and carry him down the stairs, with Shadow struggling mightily the whole way. Halfway down the stairs, Shadow went berserk. He yelped and growled and snapped his teeth at Noah, who let go of him in surprise. Shadow raced up the stairs and scampered under the couch. Without the dog's protection, Noah and I abandoned our mission. That night, we were all around the kitchen table having dinner. Shadow had been in a sour mood ever since the incident on the basement stairs. As we were eating dinner, Shadow rested on the kitchen floor, his eyes never leaving the basement door. His ears were perked up and his attention was focused on the door. At one point, his hackles raised and he rose to his feet, snarling and growling at the door. We all stopped our dinner chatter and turned to look at the dog. Shadow was in full-on protection mode. He was snarling like someone was coming up the stairs. This lasted for a moment before he calmed down and went back to lying down on the kitchen floor. It was maybe a night or two later when I first heard the footsteps. I was lying in bed in the middle of the night when I distinctly heard footsteps coming up the basement steps. They were heavy, very deliberate steps, slow and steady. Thump, thump, thump. I strained my ears as much as I could in the darkness. When the steps reached the top of the basement stairs, there was a pause. I didn't hear the basement door open, but the steps then started through the kitchen. Thump, thump, thump. When they reached the bottom of the staircase, again there was a pause. Then just as slowly and deliberately, the footsteps started up the stairs. By this point, I was wild-eyed in terror, but I honestly couldn't think of what to do next. I was frozen in place in my bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. The footsteps reached the top of the staircase, at the end of the hallway leading to our bedrooms. Again, a pause. Then the lumbering steps started down the hallway. They slowly advanced past Noah's room. Thump, thump, thump. God forgive me, but I prayed that they continued down the hall towards my mother's room. But they did not. The steps stopped right outside of my bedroom door. There was a long, painfully drawn-out moment when everything seemed to stop. I wasn't breathing. I wasn't moving. My pulse was thundering in my ears, and every nerve in my body was howling. After what seemed like an eternity, the next noise jangled my senses. It was a tapping noise, almost maddeningly quiet at first. Something was tapping on my bedroom door about once every 3 seconds or so. As I strained to listen to it, I felt that it sounded rather metallic, like a key. It sounded like someone was tapping a key on my bedroom door. Tap, tap, tap. Just as I was beginning to think of an escape route, perhaps going out my bedroom window, suddenly it stopped. My eyes must have been the size of hubcaps as I stared at the door. I figured next whatever was on the other side of the door would turn the doorknob. Seconds went by. The air was thick and suffocating. I was plotting my route to my bedroom window should the door fly open. However, I was taken by surprise with the next sound. The footsteps started again, but again they started from the bottom of the basement steps. Thump, thump, thump. What the hell? How on earth did this thing get back down to the basement without me hearing it? It was at this point that I had enough. I jumped out of my bed, threw open my door, and raced to my mother's bedroom. When I entered her room and flipped on the light, I saw that she was sitting up in bed, completely awake and aware, her eyes wide and panicked. She had heard it too. When she saw me, she immediately tried to downplay the situation. She smoothed my hair and rubbed my back and tried to convince me I had a nightmare. But I knew better. I could see in her eyes she was as unnerved as I was. It was then that I realized that whatever was in this house was terrifying my mother as much as it was terrifying me. And that made my blood run cold. My dad came home from his road trip, and for a few days, things returned to normal. My mother and I exchanged nervous glances across the table as we had dinner with my father. He was completely oblivious to the situation, and we obviously didn't know how to bring it up with him. How do you tell a burly trucker that you heard a ghost coming up the basement steps? Eventually, he had to go out on the road again. I could sense the tension in my mother as she helped him pack up for his next road trip. She tried to play it off with us kids, but I knew better. I was dreading what was coming next as much as she was. The first night home without my father seemed to be uneventful. I was uneasy and slept fitfully that whole night, but nothing of importance happened. At least not for me. The next morning at the breakfast table, I noticed my sister Rachel seemed to be a little unkempt. She was normally annoyingly bubbly and vibrant in the morning, but this morning she seemed a little disheveled. Eventually, she turned to my mother. "Thanks for closing my window last night, Mom. The rain would have ruined everything." My mother blinked for a moment while holding the coffee pot. "What are you talking about, Rachel?" Rachel seemed a little confused. "Mom, you came into my room last night and shut my window. Remember?" My mother was now more than a little disturbed. "No, Rachel, I didn't come into your room." "What do you mean?" Rachel was now frustrated. She started using that tone that preteen girls use when condescending to their mothers. "Mom, I woke up last night because it was thundering and raining outside. You were standing next to my window and you closed it and then walked out. I remember because your white nightgown was flapping in the breeze coming through the window." The color drained out of my mother's face, and the lines around her mouth suddenly became very pronounced. I had never seen her looking so old. "Dear, I don't have a white nightgown. You know my nightgown is red. You know that, Rachel." After a very uncomfortable few moments, my mother regained her composure and suddenly switched gears. "You had a dream. Honey, it was just a dream." Confused and frustrated, Rachel was now defiant. "No, that wasn't a dream, Mom. My window was open when I went to bed, and it was closed in the morning." "You closed it. Why don't you remember?" My mother was flustered. Her cheeks burned red, and she stared at the kitchen table. Her head jerked up, and she looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. "Oh, you're running late, dear. Get ready for school." A few days later, Noah and I were raising hell outside in the yard again. We came around the corner of the house and stopped in our tracks. An old tricycle that had been out in our backyard was sitting there directly underneath Rachel and Emily's bedroom window. On closer inspection, we noticed that the seat of the tricycle was bent slightly, as if someone very big and heavy had been standing on top of the seat. There were also not one, but two cigarette butts lying on the ground next to the trike. Eventually, Noah stated the obvious. Was a guy standing on this to look in Rachel's window? I didn't answer. I picked up the tricycle and whipped it as far as my little frame would allow back into our backyard. Noah looked at me for a moment with a puzzled look on his face, but he let the moment pass, and we went back to playing. A couple of days passed with relatively little happening, but one morning, it was Noah who came to the breakfast table looking haggard. I questioned him about what was going on, but he waved me off. His eyes kept darting around the kitchen table, as if he was looking for someone who was missing. Eventually, our mother joined us at the table, and Noah spoke up. "Mom, did Dad get back last night?" Our mother looked dazed for a second. No, honey, Daddy didn't come home yet." "Why did you ask?" Noah furrowed his brow and looked down into his cereal bowl for a long moment. He leveled his eyes at our mother and said, But he came to my room last night." I was getting all too familiar with the unnerved look that swept across my mother's face. She pursed her lips for a moment before croaking. "Did you have a dream last night, Noah?" Noah sighed and shook his head. He seemed to be far too world-weary for a boy his age. "Mom, you know I sleep with a radio on next to my bed, right?" My mother nodded her head very slowly and deliberately, her eyes never leaving Noah's. The lines around her mouth became very pronounced again. Noah continued, "Well, last night I woke up because the radio dial was spinning up and down like someone was looking for a radio station. I sat up and looked, and Dad was standing next to my bed, fiddling with the radio dial. There was a long moment of silence as my mother stared at Noah. Her lips were pursed tight as if she had tasted something sour. Eventually, she broke the silence. "Was that it? Was there anything else, Noah?" Noah looked more befuddled than ever. He gave the room another scan, as if he couldn't believe that our father would come around the corner at any moment. "Well, I talked to him," Noah said. Mom's eyebrows went up. "Oh," she said. "Did he say anything back?" "No," Noah responded. I said, "Hi, Daddy," but he didn't say anything back. He just turned around and walked out of the room, and I went back to sleep. Our mother stared at Noah for an uncomfortably long moment. This was the first time I noticed gray streaks hanging down in her brunette hair. In a moment, she suddenly snapped back to her normal self. Her face brightened and she said, "It was just a dream, baby. You were dreaming. Don't worry about it." Noah wasn't as convinced. He frowned deeply as he turned back to his cereal. The rest of us were mostly silent as we finished our breakfast and went off to school. The footsteps hadn't stopped in the meantime. The pattern would always repeat. The footsteps would lumber up the basement steps, then up the stairwell, and then stop outside of my bedroom door. Why was it always my bedroom door? And then it would start tapping on the door. It would tap for a while, and then the pattern would repeat back from the bottom of the basement steps. As routine as it became, I couldn't get used to it. I was as terrified on the 10th night as I was on the first. I was convinced that whatever was tapping on the door would burst in eventually. It was almost more maddening to me that it never did. It just kept repeating on that same damned loop over and over again. For how long? Was it doing it even when I wasn't home? One afternoon, I had dozed off on the couch in the living room while watching my after-school cartoons. I started to groggily come to a bit when I became aware of a presence within the room with me. I kept my eyes closed tightly, but my brain snapped back to awareness as my ears went on high alert. Someone was standing at the entrance to the living room, shifting uneasily from one foot to another. I could hear the wooden floorboards squeaking underneath the person's feet. The person started slowly advancing towards me on the couch. Each floorboard squeaked distinctly as the footsteps grew closer. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the couch, near my feet. Whoever this might be was now clearly standing at the end of the couch, staring at me. I sensed the presence as it started to lean over the couch. Lean over me. I heard its clothes rustle slightly as it loomed over me. Its face had to be inches from mine, but I never heard nor felt its breath. It was there, but it was not breathing. It was not alive. In my panic, I started to make a high-pitched, whimpering sound that I couldn't control. It was at that moment that a sharp blast of cold air washed over me, sending up goose pimples over my entire body. And then nothing. The presence was gone. I knew it immediately. It wasn't there anymore. I leapt off that couch and out of the living room, probably without even touching the ground. I started noticing my mother growing more and more uncomfortable and restless. She didn't have to say it. I knew she was experiencing things, too. At first, I noticed she used to stay up later and later at night when my father wasn't home. Whether it was watching late-night television or busying herself with household chores like staying up to sew patches on her clothes. It was obvious that she didn't want to go to bed. She installed glow-in-the-dark light switch covers in her bedroom and in the second-floor hallway. At first, it seemed like a benign safety measure, until it occurred to me what those glow-in-the-dark covers actually were for. She wanted to see the shadows moving around in the dark. They couldn't be real to her unless she saw them moving through her room. Things came to a head one night, which ended up being our last night alone in the house. My father was again gone on a road trip. We were all huddled in the living room watching television with my mother. It was late, but not terribly late, maybe 10 o'clock or so. Suddenly, a very heavy mood enveloped the room. We all sensed it immediately. I looked over at Noah and Rachel on the couch with me. The unease was evident on their faces. Emily was sprawled on the floor in front of us. She whipped her head around and looked at the rest of us as if to say, "Do you feel that too?" We did. Our mother was in the recliner beside us. Her response was to gather up Emily off of the floor and join us on the couch. All of us huddled together. She stretched her arms around all of us. The air in the room became thick and heavy. We all kept our eyes focused on the doorway between the living room and the kitchen. It seemed whatever was causing this feeling was going to be materializing there. It was Emily who first started to whimper and cry. She was quickly followed by the rest of us children. We were all grasping each other's tight as we could, now openly crying and blubbering. Eventually, even my mother started to moan with tears in her eyes. Shadow went on full alert. He stood in the middle of the living room floor, staring at the doorway with every muscle in his body taut. His hackles raised, and he started a low rumbling in his throat. The footsteps started as they always did at the bottom of the basement steps. Thump, thump. Shadow started barking in a frenzy, flashing his teeth and throwing spittle. That was enough for my mother. She threw open the front door and ushered us all out of the house as if it were a fire drill. We ran to the neighbor's house, and my mother made up some excuse for needing shelter for the night. I think she said she thought we had a gas leak or something like that. We slept fitfully on a pallet on the neighbor's living room floor. At the first sign of light the next day, we started loading up all of our earthly possessions and taking them to my grandparents' house. The house on Alder Street was the elephant in the room for my family for decades afterwards. All of us kids grew up and had families of our own, and even then, we wouldn't say much about what happened in that house. Only now do I dare to document all of it here. I don't even know why, really. I guess I just needed to convince myself that it was all in the past, and it's all over now. So again, if you don't believe in spirits, or ghosts, or the paranormal, or whatever, I won't try to convince you, but I know for a fact there are things shuffling around in the darkness. The shadows of Marrow Park. Sometimes I miss the dreamy sensations that came with childhood, like the excitement of visiting an amusement park. Back then, they seemed like dreamlands nestled in reality, and it was as though no kid could wait to visit them. My younger brother and I were no exceptions. Whenever summertime rolled around, we would eagerly count down the days until Marrow Park opened its gates. Never heard of it. Marrow Park is a very old amusement park in our hometown of Rye, New York, and it was always the place to be when we were kids. I made many fond memories at that park. The first time I rode the famous dragon coaster, playing frisbee on the park's beach with my brother and father, and the night my crush kissed me on the cheek as we watched the fireworks display from the boardwalk. One particular memory, however, overshadows the rest. It was the night our adult sister and her boyfriend had brought us to Marrow Park. The four of us had spent the day riding the coasters, playing mini golf and so on, but what my brother and I were really looking forward to was going on the dark rides. You know, those indoor rides through dark tunnels with different scenery and animatronics. At the time, there were rumors going around that all of Marrow Park's dark rides were going to be shut down, so we were adamant about paying them our final respects. Ryan insisted on waiting until nightfall before riding them, so I assumed he wanted to go on the zombie castle or the flying witch first. But once the sun had disappeared behind the ceiling, instead he hurried us to the tamest of the dark rides, Ye Old Mill. While the other two dark rides take you through castles infested with zombies and monsters, this one takes you on a boat ride through caves inhabited by Disney-esque gnomes and trolls. I asked him, "You want to ride this one first? I thought you were our main thrill seeker." "Yeah, I am," he replied, "but I want to try something." I could hear a bit of mischief in his voice. "Try what?" "I heard that if you go on this ride alone at night, you can see a ghost at one part." "Okay, so it was clearly only a rumor he had heard at school, but what would one expect from a 9-year-old? I, who was 11 at the time, just brushed it off, although I was admittedly a superstitious kid. Just wait here, I'm going on first. He turned to run to the ticket booth when Julia swiftly stepped in front of him. No, you're not, she snapped. Don't you remember what happened last year? Oh, I muttered to myself. I had almost forgotten about the incident that had occurred on the ride looming above us, a tragedy that had played out like a horror story. You see, Marrow Park has a small record of deadly accidents, one of which occurred in 2005. A 7-year-old boy had gone on the old mill alone, having passed its minimum height requirement. His mother, who had been waiting outside, was terrified to find that the boat he was riding in returned empty. The news later broke out that authorities had discovered his body stuck beneath one of the conveyor belts used to move the boats, under more than 2 feet of water. There were no eyewitnesses to the accident, and inspectors found nothing wrong with the ride itself. So it was believed that the boy became frightened and climbed out of the boat in an attempt to escape. According to the boy's autopsy, the cause of his death wasn't by drowning, but blunt force trauma to the head. He'll be fine as long as he stays in the boat, I said. Julia frowned at me as Ryan nodded in agreement. Even though I understood why she was worried, I thought she was overreacting. The old mill was one of the safest rides in the park, and our little thrill seeker didn't scare easily. Look, you two can just ride it together. The ghost might appear anyway, right? Yeah, guys, Mason chimed in. You can take it like a pair of Ghostbusters. The cheesiness of that line made me laugh, as did the face Ryan made in response. I said to him, sounds fine to me. He just sighed in defeat. Oh, all right. As Ryan walked up to the booth, Julia put a hand on my shoulder and quietly said, don't let him do anything stupid, okay? I turned to see her face dark with concern. Hell, she sounded like she expected us not to come back. What did she think Ryan would do? Jump ship and hide in the scenery? Sounds silly, but it was technically possible. The old mill has narrow concrete paths running along the walls for staff access, so people could hop out of the sluggish boats and go exploring. To try and calm her down, I placed a hand on her shoulder and said, okay, I won't let him get eaten by the robot gnomes. Oh, shut up and go already. She gave me a playful rap over the head before checking out the nearby game booths with Mason, leaving Ryan and me to board the ride. With no line in front of us, it was only moments before we boarded one of the boats and were on our way into the old mill. Rounding the first bend, we were greeted by an animatronic gnome in mining gear perched on a pipe above us. Welcome to Marrow Waterworks, it announced in its usual Western accent. We're keeping it flowing down here, but stay in the boat and on the main waterways. There's hungry trolls hiding in those back caverns. With that, the boat drifted into the unlighted tunnels ahead. Do you ever get the feeling that a room seems darker when you know it's dark outside? Never having been on the old mill at night, I was getting that sense. Aside from the lights on the scenery, the tunnels were completely black. I tend to get a little anxious in really dark places since my eyesight isn't the greatest, but being with Ryan helped alleviate that anxiety. For the first couple minutes, we just poked fun at the scenes we passed, which consisted of the gnomes performing generic mining duties, digging for gems, blasting stone with TNT, and accidentally blowing each other up in the cartoony covered-in-soot way, of course. At one point I asked him, so, when's this ghost supposed to appear again? I don't know, he replied with a shrug. But it wouldn't be in here, it's too bright. Maybe if we're really quiet. We had just entered a room full of mock machinery, the set brightly lit. Both of us went silent, so I just listened to the bouncy music playing over the speakers. I heard a sharp clicking sound a couple times as we passed through the room. Assuming it was the music skipping or something, I ignored it and thought about the accident. That kid must have been really afraid of the dark. That or the scarier scenes got to him. But still, to frighten him enough to want to climb out of the boat. My contemplation abruptly ended when Ryan turned excitedly towards me. This could be it. Get ready. This is where the memory becomes more vivid for me, as though it happened last night. Ever since I was little, This particular part of the ride struck me as foreboding. As the boat made another turn, the comical music emanating from the machine room faded out, overtaken by the sound of gusty winds. A white strobe light flickered in the distance while faux thunder echoed through the corridor, creating the illusion of getting caught in a summer storm. The chilling atmosphere was amplified by light mist spraying about, surrounding us in a cool embrace. There's nothing here, I thought to myself. Nothing here except us. But then I heard it again. Click, 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 just like in the last room. Without the music and voices of the animatrons, I could hear it more clearly. It reminded me of the sound a dog's claws make when it walks across a hard floor. I glanced around, even though I couldn't see a damn thing, and tried to locate the sound. Then it occurred to me that the only floors around were the paths alongside the boat. Hey, do you hear that? I asked Ryan. What? That clicking so. A crash of thunder suddenly burst from the speakers, cutting me off and making my heart leap. But what frightened me more was that as soon as the thunder rang out, I thought I heard something splash in the water behind us. What? Did you hear the ghost? Ryan asked. And no, I stammered, disappointed. He turned away from me without even noticing my unease. As our lonely vessel drifted beyond the stormy hull, I listened carefully for the clicking sound again. Click, click, click. There it was, sure enough. What the hell is that? I thought. I was beginning to think it was just in my head, but then I heard something else alongside it. Clack, clack, clack. It was just like the clicking, only heavier, sharper. Go back, please, a worried voice warned us. I noticed we were drifting by the next scene, a gnome with a lantern waving at us from a small cliff. Last chance. They'll get you for sure. Please, don't go back there. From that point forward, my imagination started to run away with me. I began to think the puppets were trying to warn us of some real, imminent danger, regardless of the fact that they were only reciting their usual lines. I wasn't even focused on the scenery anymore, instead fearfully staring at the floor of the boat while my mind ran wild. If a ghost were haunting the ride, would it try to hurt us? I warn you, humans. I heard one of the troll puppets shout. Go away now. What if someone who had come in before us decided to hide in the scenery and scare whoever passed by? What if that person was dangerous? Or maybe, instead of some phantom or adolescent trickster, we're being watched by something else? It's too late now. Another troll said, letting out a low, wicked laugh. I finally looked up, recognizing the scene in front of me. The troll was stationed next to a sharpened log, suspended by vines. A trap. The log suddenly swung forward as the tunnel was engulfed in darkness. A crashing sound played moments later. Just before the crash, I let a scream slip out as I heard another splash. This time, it wasn't as far behind. What? What is it? Ryan shouted back in surprise. Didn't you hear that? I stammered. Something's in here. In the water. He paused a moment, as though to say he had been hearing something as well throughout the ride. Why, you better not be joking. He was trying to sound tough, but he couldn't mask the fear in his voice. The trepidation I had felt since the stormy hull had finally overtaken me. I was on the brink of tears, glancing every which way to find the source of that godforsaken sound of claws on stone. I hoped and prayed that we would come to a tunnel with more light and fast. Click, click, click. I held my breath, frozen in terror. Whatever was making that sound was right beside the boat. For the first time, I heard it breathing. It took in quiet, shallow, croaking gasps as if it was struggling for air. It wasn't the mournful moaning of a child's spirit, however. No, it didn't even sound human. I had to know, despite the temptation to just hide my face in my sweaty hands. I had to know what in God's name was following us, summoning whatever little courage I had. I slowly turned my head to the path on my left. Fear pierced my heart as I met the incandescent gaze of two green, unblinking eyes. They were wide and blank like those of an anglerfish, but I couldn't make out the head they were attached to. I heard its claws lightly click against the concrete as it crept alongside the boat. Its eyes locked onto me. Shivering, I took in only quick, stilted breaths, afraid that any sudden movement or sound would cause it to attack. I wanted to warn my brother and tell him not to move, but before I could, "What's that noise?" he asked meekly. I heard his body shift as he turned to face me. Suddenly, he let out a scream, clearly seeing what I saw. The creature immediately averted its eyes from me and locked onto my terrified brother, responding to his scream with a loud hiss. It darted past me and leapt towards him at alarming speed. Ryan cried and screamed in pain, snapping me out of my fear-induced paralysis. Without thinking, I reached out to pull the infernal thing off of him, fumbling in the darkness until I got a hold of it. It wasn't very big, but it was powerful. The rough scales that made up its exterior dug into my skin as it writhed and squirmed relentlessly in my arms. I was about to throw it overboard when I suddenly felt several claws strike me across the face. I shrieked and clasped my hands to my face as the damn creature slipped free. "Get it away," Ryan cried. "It's going to kill us." Wiping my eyes of what was either blood or tears, I turned around to see those faint green eyes burning into mine. All at once I felt a churning blend of fear and rage. And as it approached again, I swung my leg as hard as I could. The creature let out what sounded like a gasp as my foot slammed against it. Realizing I had the upper hand, I rushed forward and kicked at it again and again and again, before backing towards my sobbing brother, still unable to see anything in the darkness but those eyes. I watched as they unsteadily turned from us and disappeared over the rear of the boat with a splash. To my relief, the boat was just starting to pass one of the next scenes, offering us just enough light to see. "Quick, it's gone. Get out of the boat." Thanks to the adrenaline coursing through me, I was able to pull myself onto the concrete walkway beside the set and Ryan after me. I could see his wounds in the dim, orange light. His legs were scratched up, as was his chest, visible through his torn shirt. But his worst injury was on his left arm, drenched in blood. He was tightly clutching a large mark between the wrist and elbow. "It bit me," he sobbed repeatedly. There was no way in hell we could stay any longer. "Come on, we need to get help." I choked out, trying to catch my breath. Thankfully, he was still able to walk. By sticking close to the wall, we were able to find our way to the next set without falling off the narrow walkway. The scene was of a troll cutting down a tree, so I knew we were close to the end of the ride. "Don't worry, we're almost there." "Almost." Clack, clack, clack. The familiar sound stopped us in our tracks. I began to tremble, ready to sob out of utter disbelief. No, that's not real," I told myself, but what followed was unmistakable. A furious, hissing roar right behind us. Instinctively, I turned around, just in time to see another glowing pair of eyes charging in our direction. "Run!" I screamed. We bolted towards the end of the set as the second creature entered the room. I looked back for a moment to see how far behind it was, catching a blurry glimpse of its appearance. It was some ungodly animal, larger than the other one, clawing its way toward us like an enraged crocodile. Its eyes burned bright yellow-orange like twin torches, and its teeth seemed to be bared and jagged. All I could see of the body itself was a grayish-red color, but I wasn't about to stop to get a closer look. My brother and I scrambled into another black corridor, the longest in the entire ride, and saw the light of the last set visible at the end of it. I thought we were in the home stretch, but the next thing I knew, something clamped onto my right leg. I fell forward and hit my head against the floor, calling out to Ryan and reaching out with my arms. "What happened?" "Hurry," he cried. "I can't." I cried back. I felt the creature tug on me, sending a splitting pain through my leg. Thinking I had been bitten as well, I looked behind and saw that the glowing eyes weren't that close to me at all. I quickly realized that it had ensnared me with some kind of appendage. With his arm hurt, my brother couldn't pull back, which left only one option. Get help. Get out and get help now. What? But it'll. Go now. Run. With that, I heard my brother's crying grow fainter and fainter. As he hurried to the end of the tunnel, the beast growled as it tugged on me again, pulling me closer to what would certainly be my demise. I desperately felt around for anything to grab onto or use as a weapon, to no avail. I tried to grip the edge of the walkway and pull myself free, my mind overrun with thoughts of my family, the memories of that park, and the child with whom I was about to share a final resting place. Then, the creature's growling became a dry hiss, croaky and shallow like that of its smaller counterpart. Its tugging was more frequent, but not quite as strong. It wasn't clear to me then, but I now believe that it was losing its breath. In one last attempt to escape, I kicked at my right leg with my left, trying to hit the spot where its extra set of jaws had latched on. Again and again and again I kicked with all the strength I could muster. Finally, unable to last above the surface any longer, the creature released my leg and leapt into the water. I watched the fiery glow of its eyes fade as it swam back into the depths of the old mill. Fearing that it would return, I didn't waste any time trying to get away. As I crawled toward the light of the last set, battered and bleeding, all the trauma I had endured suddenly caught up with me. My head throbbed violently and my arms grew weak, the whole world melting into a bleary mess before my eyes. The last I recall of this nightmarish memory is the glint of a flashlight, the garbled voices of Marrow Park staff members, and the last animatronic gnome shouting, "I warned ya! I warned ya!" I awoke the next day in a hospital bed. My dear younger brother was in the bed next to mine, still asleep. I would learn later that day that he had stumbled out of the ride pale and hysterical, screaming over and over that there was a monster in the ride, and that I was going to die. God in heaven, our little thrill seeker got so much more than what he bargained for. We all did. The authorities later concluded that we had been attacked by wild dogs that had somehow found their way into the ride. What other explanation could they give? There haven't been any incidents like this since then, so I can only assume the real culprits no longer reside in the old mill. Only God knows what they were or where they are now. Those soulless, incandescent eyes continue to haunt me, and perhaps they always will. Even more haunting, though, are the terrified cries of my brother. It brings me to tears to think what could have happened if I'd let him get on that ride alone. The Missing Four. What you're about to read actually happened while I was on an internship during the fall of 2014. In order to protect people's privacy, I'm not including the names of my friends, the company I worked with at the time, or the name of my university. But after you read my account, if you feel skeptical or otherwise have any questions about my experience, feel free to email me at 245-3396-381@qq.com. I know the address looks like a spam email, but QQ is actually an extremely popular social networking site in mainland China since Facebook, Twitter, and all the Western networks are blocked by the Chinese government. The reason for the suspicious username is that your QQ number is randomly generated and assigned to you when creating an account. That's right, your identity is literally reduced to an itemized number until you provide personal details on your account. In fall of 2014, I got a job as a supervisor over 13 volunteer English teachers. I would be working in a Chinese city called Weihai, pronounced Weihai, located in Shandong province. The company that hired me sends English teachers to Mexico, India, China, Russia, and Ukraine each semester. I was super excited at the opportunity because not only would I have the chance to live in China again, I'd originally been one of the volunteers for this same program several years prior, but my university was willing to grant me a semester's worth of Chinese language credits as an academic internship. I could get good job experience, live abroad in a country that I consider my second home, and complete a semester of school. It was my dream semester. In Weihai, The volunteers and I lived and worked at a prestigious international private school. They treated us really well. One of the biggest perks being that in addition to taking the same vacation days as the school's faculty that took place over China's national holidays, we also got an extra week or two of personal vacation time. It was during one of these vacations that I had one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. Two of my friends from the group, I'll call them Emily and Mark, decided they wanted to travel down south to China's Guangdong province during the Dragon Boat Festival. I suggested that we visit Yangshuo, a little-known village surrounded on all sides by the region's gorgeous mountains. I'd visited it a year before and wasn't about to pass up an opportunity to visit there again. Search Google images of Yangshuo's scenery and you'll understand why I'm so crazy about the place. Yangshuo isn't a large town, but even so, if you plan to do everything that you want while you're there, you need transportation since most of the things to do are out in the countryside. The problem was that we'd chosen a super busy time of year to visit such a popular tourist location. All the traffic in the area the entire 6 days we were there was literally a continuous traffic jam, so taking cabs or hiring rickshaws was an option. We were fine though, as we'd rented some bikes which gave us the freedom to go anywhere we wanted. It actually worked out even better than relying on cabs, because we would be able to get to some of the places that were out of the way and inaccessible by car. I remembered some mud caves pretty deep in the countryside that I'd visited before. It was about an hour outside of town by bike, so it was more than a little out of the way. But its secluded nature was one of the reasons it was such an appealing destination, especially during such a busy holiday, where it was nice to have a break from all the tourists. I convinced Emily and Mark to make the trip to these mud caves, explaining how we'd already done everything there is to do immediately around the city. They reluctantly agreed, and on the morning of the 5th day, we grabbed our bikes and headed out. We rode for an hour and a half, 2 hours. After the 2-hour mark, I realized that I must have gotten us lost. Granted, it had been quite a while since I'd last been there, so I think it's understandable that I didn't remember the route. Regardless, I felt stupid and guilty because I talked up the mud caves so much to my friends, and it looked like we weren't even going to make it to them. Not only that, we seemed to be in a completely isolated section of countryside. I spoke the language, so finding our way back to town wasn't going to be a problem, provided we found another person. For what it looked like, we were in the middle of the wilderness. I was worried that I'd inadvertently wasted one of the last days of our vacation. I explained the situation to my friends, who groaned and were noticeably annoyed at me, but who, to their credit, didn't complain or even blame me for ruining their vacation. That actually made me feel even worse about my screw-up. This was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I knew that losing a vacation day was no small matter to them. We stopped our bikes and began discussing what we should do. Should we continue following the current trail and maybe find someone further along the way? Should we try to backtrack and run into someone closer to the main road? Should we just abandon our original plan and try to find something else to do out in the country? While we were deciding what course of action we should take, I noticed some old-looking buildings hidden within a valley, obscured by the thick vegetation clinging to the steep mountain slopes. I was elated. There was bound to be some people in or around those buildings, and it couldn't have been more than a 15-minute ride from where we currently were. Aside from which, some of the most memorable places in China are the ones that you stumble upon by accident, the ones that aren't known as big touristy places. Our bad luck could turn out to be a good thing after all. It was evident as we rode our bikes into the enclave that it had been abandoned for some time. The buildings were obviously once part of an old commune from the Maoist era, when communism was in full swing and everyone was required to live in communal compounds. After Mao's death and Deng Xiaoping started on economic reforms to move China away from communism, people deserted these communes to make a life in the city and chase a capitalistic dream. So what we'd stumbled upon was actually a really cool piece of Chinese history. We decided to check it out, look around, take some pictures, etc., etc. The entire compound was an enormous Saihayuan which is essentially a house contained in the walls surrounding a large courtyard that usually contains smaller structures. Again, you can Google it for a better idea of what it looks like. In this case, though, it wasn't just a single household. It was an entire walled community. The walls themselves comprised the living quarters. The central area contained an overgrown field where they would have kept the publicly owned livestock. It looked like some animals had taken up residence since the people left. Some goats and cows grazed the long grass, and chickens clucked around their feet. Scattered around the perimeter of the field were a few rundown buildings dotting the compound, which I assume at one point were the dining hall, and some small facilities for textile mills or small-time industrial production plants, depending on what this place specialized in. We checked around the living area, and it was immediately clear that this place had been abandoned for several decades. The rooms were almost completely vacant. Only furniture and a few odd assortments of possessions, woks, chopsticks, portraits of Mao, were left behind, creating a sort of gloomy atmosphere amid the cracked, crumbling walls. We snapped some pictures, recorded some videos, and just generally took in the scenery. We were getting ready to leave when I heard a voice coming from the far end of the commune. Was somebody still living here? It was possible. We had seen some animals left in the central area. After all, I'd assumed they were wild, but it made sense that somebody was still raising them. In fact, it probably made more sense because it didn't seem very likely that stray animals would find their way inside a gated community like this. We approached the apartment where the voice was coming from. The front door was slightly ajar, and the rich smell of incense wafted out. The voice continued droning on, almost like a chant. Mark spoke up. "You think this guy knows the way back to Yangshuo? You should ask for directions." I thought maybe the person inside was performing some kind of religious ceremony, so I was reluctant to interrupt him, and I said as much. "We don't know how long they're going to take in there. Do you seriously just want to wait outside their door for a couple hours like a bunch of creepers? Just knock on the door, and if what they think they're doing is really important, then they'll ask us to wait and give us directions when they're done." I was a little bit annoyed by that, because Mark had a tendency to use our celebrity status as white people to expect special treatment from Chinese nationals. I prefer to try to blend in with the culture as much as I could, and I have a strong respect for local customs, particularly religious ones. But he also had a point. Chinese people are naturally hospitable and eager to help others. If this person was a devout Buddhist or Taoist, then their willingness to help us would be even greater, and they would most likely drop whatever they were doing the second they saw us. So I rapped lightly on the door. There was no response. I knocked a bit louder, and the person continued mumbling to themselves. I opened the door slightly and called out to them to alert them of our presence. "Wei, Wei, and I hao, ni hao." The chanting stopped for a moment, almost imperceptibly, but then continued as though nothing happened. I pushed the door open all the way and saw an elderly, hunchbacked man wandering around the room, shaking a wooden tool as he hobbled about, mumbling his incantation. He was certainly a communist-era comrade. His hunched posture and wrinkled, yet callous skin told of years of hard work. He was practically doubled over at the waist and only had a few wispy white hairs on the top of his head. His clothes were the classical communist fare, dark gray pants with a matching button-up shirt that reached his Adam's apple, along with a squared-off cap. He must have taken great care of his clothing because they were in surprisingly good shape, considering they were from around the 1950s. It's not like anyone could find a replacement for era-specific clothing 60 years after the fact. Even more surprising than his physical appearance, however, was the state of his apartment. Given how empty the rest of the rooms were in this commune, I was shocked at how decorated this one was. It looked as though he'd scavenged everything his neighbors had left behind when they left. None of the walls were accessible because tables had been pushed up against them, occupying every inch of the room's perimeter. The tabletops were completely covered by candles, statues of miniature Buddhas in various poses, wilted flowers, beaded bracelets and necklaces, the shoes of infants, calligraphy drawn carefully on rice paper, and what looked like the personal effects of loved ones who had either passed away or abandoned him. There looked to be thousands of other items that I couldn't even begin to identify. I approached him and began to speak, asking if he was familiar with Yangshuo and if he would be able to help us find our way back to the main road. In response, he only muttered a short phrase, "Wishao si ji ren." Wo shao si ji run. Wishao si ji run. I'm short for people. Was this person expecting company? Excuse me, I asked in Mandarin. Wishao si ji run. He repeated again, urgently. He glanced at me, and then his eyes darted to Emily and Mark. He looked between the three of us, repeating this phrase over and over. I felt bad. This poor man must have been senile. Maybe his friends or family had left the commune and promised to come back, and he was still awaiting their return. Or maybe he was just pretty far gone and honestly believed he was preparing to receive 4 guests who hadn't yet arrived. I tried communicating with him a few more times, but he simply continued mumbling this cryptic phrase, shaking the wooden object in his hand. I took a closer look and realized I'd seen the object he was holding before. It was a religious instrument used for venerating statues of Buddha. Similar to how Catholics believe that partaking of the Eucharist purifies members of their sins, Buddhists use tools like the one this man was shaking to sprinkle statues of Buddha with water, symbolically cleansing themselves. They were shaped like Spanish maracas and were riddled with tiny holes that would allow for several drops of water to escape from each hole with each shake. Sometimes people would infuse the water with lavender or other herbs to invoke a pleasant smell. I don't know what this man had mixed in with the water, but it was a pretty putrid smell. I ignored it and turned back to Emily and Mark. "What's he saying?" Emily asked. "He just keeps saying, 'I'm missing 4 people,'" I replied. "What does that mean?" "Honestly, I have no clue, but I have a feeling he's not going to be able to help us. Should we just try to head back to the main road, and hopefully we'll run into someone there who can give us directions?" "What the hell?" Mark yelled. Emily and I spun to look at him. "That old guy just soaked me," he complained, motioning to a wet spot on his shirt. I rolled my eyes. "Give him a break," I said. "He obviously doesn't know what he's doing." As I said this, the elderly man continued to shuffle around the room, sprinkling water on the statues of Buddha and the other artifacts laid out on the tables, all the while muttering, "Wishao si ji run. Wishao si ji run. I'm fine with just going, but you should at least ask him if he has any water." "My bottle's completely empty," Emily said. It was a good idea to get a refill before we left. Yangshuo is ridiculously humid and hot year-round, so even though it was already late October, it felt like mid-July in Florida. We were so sweaty that we could easily get dehydrated just by standing around, even without riding bikes. "Yeah, that's a good idea," I responded. I was about to turn to the man for one last attempt at communication to hopefully find out where we could get some water. He violently shook the maraca-like tool, drizzling water on my shoes and the floor around my feet. Some even splashed up on the pant legs of my shorts. "Wishao si ji run," he muttered again, but this time it caused a chill to run through me. Something didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was wrong. "Wishao si ji run." I took a step toward the man and felt my foot slide slightly as it touched the floor. I looked down and saw the unnatural layer of gray dust that had collected on the floor. How could there be so much dust on the floor if someone lived here? "Wishao si ji run." I was getting increasingly uncomfortable and felt the urge to leave, but I couldn't understand why. I glanced over to Emily, about to speak, when I realized something I hadn't noticed before. Maybe I missed it due to all the clutter, but this room was in noticeably worse condition than the others. The walls had black stains on them. The wood in the window frame was blackened and seemingly shattered, far more brittle than those of other apartments. It almost seemed like this specific apartment survived a series of accidents, but was still somehow standing. So why was this the only room left occupied? "Wishao si ji run." The broken old man shuffled past once again, and this time I got a quick spray in the face. The powerful odor assaulted my nostrils. The smell of the scented water was off. It was too potent, too abrasive. It almost had a toxic fragrance to it. It made me want to cough, to get it out of my nose and throat. Washao sig run. An icy shiver ran through me as I made a sudden realization. Guys, we need to go. Now, I said. I didn't wait for Emily or Mark to respond. I made for the door and ran until I reached my bike. Hey, what's going on? Mark called out as he caught up with me midway through the courtyard. Why'd you ditch us? Emily asked. They'd both caught up to me and were mounting their bikes, slightly out of breath. I didn't answer them. We rode the trail we entered through in silence. After only about half an hour of riding, we stumbled upon some hikers, both Swedish. They spoke impeccable English, which was good because I wasn't in the mood for talking and Emily was eager to take over so we could find our way back to the hostel. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were back at the hostel, that Emily insisted that I tell them what had me so freaked out. What's going on? Ever since we were at that creepy old guy's house, you've been acting really weird. I didn't want to tell them because I was hoping that if I kept it to myself, then maybe the realization I made would somehow be less real. Maybe if I didn't say it out loud, then I could believe that it hadn't really happened. But it had. Remaining silent about it wouldn't change that. I sighed. You know what the guy kept repeating? Yeah, you told us it means I'm short for people. That can't be what's bothering you, though. That's not what he was saying. I heard it wrong, I replied. You see, the thing about Chinese is that tones make all the difference. For example, if you hear GG, GUH, it could either mean older brother or each and every, depending on what tones are used. What I thought was, I'm missing 4 people wasn't that at all. It wasn't until I understood what he had actually sprayed me with that I realized I'd been hearing the tones wrong. He wasn't sprinkling water all over his apartment. He was sprinkling kerosene. And he wasn't saying, I'm missing 4 people. What he was really saying was, I burned everyone. Note, the romanization of the phrases in their Chinese translations are as listed below. I'm missing 4 people. Washao si jiren. I burned, literally burn kill, everyone. Washao esigarin.
And that was tonight's tale from the Shadowed Tales archive. If it left a mark on your mind, if the silence feels heavier now, then the story did what it was meant to do. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the darkness. New stories are always on their way. Until then, keep the lights low and the doors locked.